So, hello, welcome everyone. Uh, I am delighted to welcome you all to the sixth session of Edutalks, a series of talks hosted by IIIT Lucknow alongside their Pan India Hackathon Eduthon. So, a bit about Eduthon. Eduthon is a collaboration of programmers, designers, and inventors to co-design and build innovative solutions of talks that tackle real-world problems caused in the education sector due to the corona pandemic. And it will take place from the 4th to the 6th of September 2020. This session of EduTalks is being delivered by Ben Dechrai, a senior developer advocate at Auth0. Ben Sir is a technologist with a staunch focus on security and privacy. This started at the age of 11 when he wrote software to stop his parents from breaking the family PC and resulted in his working as a developer advocate for Auth0. He enjoys helping developers find the joy of experimentation, from ethical skulduggery to the subversive automation. It's a pleasure for us to host you, sir. Now over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and what an introduction. I've never actually heard anyone read that About Me page out. It's really awesome to hear. I'm just going to see whether I can share my screen here so we can see what's going on. So I've also got kind of like a summary of me on the screen at the moment. I presume that's coming through. I'm sure one of the organizers will let me know if it's not. So yeah, as mentioned, my name is Ben Dechrai. I have been a developer advocate at Auth0 now for almost 3 years. It was my first official role in a developer advocacy kind of role. But before that, I've always loved meeting people at networking sessions, meetups, conferences, giving talks, and hearing people sharing their ideas and the problems they're trying to solve. I've been coding since the age of 7, although professionally now for about 20 years. So I still love software engineering. I think it's one of the most exciting areas to work in because we can create so much just from holding our fingers on a keyboard. It's quite cool. So I want to do something different today. I often will give a talk with a presentation, some slides, help you understand or bring across some new theories or thoughts. But today I just want to jump straight into code. So if you haven't heard of Auth0, let me just jump over to here. Auth0 is basically a software as a service tool that will allow you to integrate authorization, identity, login, single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, all of these kind of things around user identity through an SDK. So if you haven't heard of Auth0, you probably have heard of Stripe. So if you want to do payments, you'll use Stripe or PayPal or one of those kind of companies. If you want to do identity, Auth0 is one of the software as a service tools that you can use to do that, which means you don't have to worry about securing database passwords in databases and making sure the hashing algorithms work and worrying about data leaks. I don't have to worry about that either. I'm not one of the developers. We have a team of awesome developers who really know their stuff to make sure that it all stays safe. So what I want to do today is look at a React app, and we'll integrate Auth0 into it. But the main thing I want to do is show you not necessarily, like the whole point is that Auth0 is supposed to just be install it and then you can carry on with your project. But I want to show you how that looks to build in, and then obviously you can take that and build on top of it. Now, most of the time I actually use Gatsby, which is obviously React-based. I'm doing pure React today, so bear with me while my brain kind of switches gear, but we should be good. So I'll jump straight over into the code editor again. And if we open it up on here, what I've done is I've just pulled out this Auth0 React demo, which is actually available, and I can share this link with people later as well. It's available at this URL here. So it's the Auth0 blog. Somebody wrote this. So I won't be going through the blog today. I'm just using this as a starting point. And if you're creating a brand new application as part of your hackathon, feel free to take this as a starting point, add the Auth0 stuff in, and you've got a React app with router built in all ready to go. So the idea here is that we have an application that's got a couple of pages. If we look at the code again, for those of you who aren't familiar with React, if you're familiar with JavaScript, you'll be fine following this through. If you're not familiar with React or JavaScript, but you are familiar with programming, especially C language style programming, you shouldn't have too much issue following through, but please know that you don't need to understand everything that I'm about to describe in order to follow along with the workshop. So the way the React works is you have the index file in the home directory here, in the source directory rather, and what we're doing is we're basically going to render the application. The application is then pulled in from app.js, and if we get rid of this here, you can see that essentially what we're getting out of the box is a router that says, okay, if we're in the just slash directory, then we render the home view, otherwise we render the profile view for profile, and also because this code base is also being used for demoing external API connections, which if we have time and you want to know about it, we can do today as well. So these three views here are defined in the views directory. So when you go to the web application to start with, we should just see this hero image and the content, and they are pulled from the component. So here we've got hero, which will basically print out this bit of text here, then the header. So rather than looking through the code, let's just run npm start, and we'll have a look at what this looks like. I haven't changed any of the code. I've just done a git clone, and we have our application running now. So that's just spinning up for the first time. And in a second, we'll see that header come through with the hero image. So we have the header, hero image, bit of extra text down here. This is out of the box. Nothing's been changed. So we've got the home page here. We've got the profile page. The profile page aligns here with this profile.js, which is basically just a header and a paragraph. And here we have that header and the paragraph. So we'll get to, within today's session, making sure this is a private route, that you shouldn't be able to get to the profile page unless you're logged in. And then again, we've got this external API here, which we can look at later if we have time. Again, that should be private, and then you can make requests here. And the point of this demo is once you're authenticated, you can get an access token so that your application can talk to APIs, and the API knows who's logged in without having to share usernames and passwords between systems. So that's a bit of a setting the stage. We know what the code is doing. Just so you know as well, I've mentioned to the organizers, if you've got any questions at any point while we're going through this, please ask the question in whichever medium you're in at the moment. They're going to collate all the questions and make sure they come through to me. I'm happy to be interrupted. I'm happy to go off on tangents to cover things if there's something that's either not making sense or something that I've not covered that you think might be interesting to talk about. I'm more than happy to make this as dynamic and tailored to what you need. So we'll start off with installing the Auth0 SDK. So I'm going to jump over here. I've created an Auth0 account already. If you don't have one, just jump over to auth0.com and go to login, sign up, log in if you have an account already. And once you've created your account, you'll end up in this getting started area. And you'll probably have a default application as well. Because I use this for various demos, I keep deleting them. So I've started with a blank slate here. You'll probably have one demo app in there. The way that the authentication SDKs work is they're split into 4 types of application. So you've got your native apps, which is like your mobile apps, and for iOS and Android. You've got your single page apps, which is what we're looking at today. So I'm just going to select that one for now. So that'll be things like React and Angular and anything that just runs in the browser. You've got your regular web applications. So when you create your account for the first time, that one application that's sitting in there just for you to play with to start with is a regular web application. And that can be something like a Python or a PHP-based server-hosted application. So if you do create an account and you want to start playing with your single page app, remember that you need to create a new application and define it as a single page application. And then we also have machine-to-machine applications. So if we get to it at some point today, if not, hit me up on social media, whenever, we can talk about it over the next few days as well. If you have an API that you want to authenticate to, you can register that API within Auth0 as well, and then the tokens can be used between your front-end application and your APIs. So we're going to stick with a single page web application over here. You can give it a name if you want. I'm just going to leave it default as my app. And this is basically creating a record in Auth0 of the application that we want to write, which stores the configuration around how that application works in terms of identity. And you can see that we default here to the Quick Start tab. We can go in and we can have a look at how to configure React, which you could follow this one through. This is another perfectly valid way of doing it. And in fact, one of the things I like about this is I'll just jump over into the Settings tab. Whenever we configure any application, there are a couple of bits of information that we need to configure in our code, and that's the domain. So that's the URL that the login page sits on, and all of the Auth0 related stuff will sit in this case at bendechrai.test.auth0.com. That first part will be whatever you select. Then there's a client ID, which is the identifier of this configuration set for the application we're writing. And sometimes we might need a client secret. Because we're writing a single page app and everything's going to be in the browser, we can't use secrets because they're hosted in the browser. Therefore, technically anybody can read them. It might be a bit tricky to find it in the code, but we still can't put the client secret in any kind of public space. So we're not going to be using the client secret today. But these 3 bits of information here are required, depending, definitely the first 2, sometimes a secret, depending on what you're setting up. One of the things I really like about the quick start is if you do follow this method, and we go through and have a look at React here, then when you're going through and looking at the code, it's actually going to put the domain and client ID into the code for you. So if I was to follow this method instead, this how-to, then copying and pasting the code, 99% of it is ready to go. I don't have to reconfigure things. I'm not going to follow this one today, though, because we're using this starter app. So let's just jump back in over here. One thing we do want to do, though, which we can copy from here, is to install the Auth0 React SDK. So until about 3 months ago, Auth0 had a single-page app SDK, which was applicable to all single-page apps. So you'd use it for React and Angular and Vue.js. And one of the things with implementing that with React was there was a little bit more that you had to do. Rather than taking, and we'll see it'll take us a couple of minutes to get it all set up, it would probably take you 2 or 3 times as long previously. Maybe it would take you 10 minutes instead of 3, or 15 instead of 5, because there was a bit more to do. So this is a specific SDK just for React. If you're using Angular or anything else, follow those how-tos. They'll use a different SDK. But this makes it a lot easier and a lot faster to jump into Auth0 with React. So I'm just going to stop npm over here, and we'll install the Auth0. I think it's Auth0 React. Yeah, Auth0 React library. We're going to install this. In the meanwhile, let's just have a quick look at the package.json. So the kind of things that we're already pulling in as part of the basic app that I cloned before. We already have Bootstrap in there. So for laying out our pages, we can do that nice and quickly and easily. We've got the React DOM router, or router DOM rather, and that's what allows the single page app to have different paths and different URLs to display different pages, which obviously in a single page app context is slightly different to the way it would be if you're loading the pages off a web server. So this is what allows us to have our routing. We've also got .env that we've pulled in, which allows us to store the credentials or the variables for connecting to Auth0 in an environment variable or an environment file. So if you go through to production, deploying it to Netlify or wherever you decide to deploy it, obviously you'll set up the environment variables there, but for development, we'll create a new file here called .env. And the environment variables that we put in here are the configuration that we will use for connecting to Auth0. So we'll put in the Auth0 domain and the Auth0 client ID. I'm just going to grab those from, let's go to the top here from the settings. So the domain is this one here. So we'll just paste this in. And the client ID is this one here. Now you'll notice the client ID, I'm pasting it into public text and you can read it here. The client ID can be public. It doesn't matter if this gets, it's not really leaked because it's not private. So we've got the domain and the client ID here. I'll just save that. And now what we're going to do is jump over to the index.js file here. This is the top level of the application. We have wrapped the entire application in the router. So that's what allows all of the components within the application to understand what the routing or have access to the routing capabilities. We then want to wrap the application between the router and the application. We want to put another little wrap in there. And this is going to be the Auth0 provider. So let's just get the capitalization right. It hasn't detected yet, so I'm just going to pull that in up here. So we want to import the Auth0 provider from Auth0 React. So the Auth0 provider comes in here, and the app goes in between. Now, there are certain extra bits of information that we need to pass in, though. So if you're familiar with what providers do, they basically similar to the way the router works, in that now the application has access to all the routing stuff. The application is now going to have access to all of the Auth0 information required to do things like logging in and seeing what the user's details are. It provides that functionality to each of the components. Previously, before we wrapped things in providers like this, you would have had to pass any data into each child component and chain that down the track, which became quite messy. So providers are a really nice way of wrapping context around your application, so that anywhere in your application you can get access to things, as we'll see in a second, like finding out whether or not the user's logged in. You'll see if you use VS Code that up here we've got a bit of information on the minimum information we require: domain client ID and also redirect URI. So let's put those in. So in this instance here, we need to put in the domain. So we know that already is going to be passed through in the process.env. Let's just copy this because it's a rather long string. And we'll also use this here for the client ID. So we've got those two defined already. The other thing we need is a redirect URI. And this is when somebody logs in, they're going to be redirected off to your, what we call a tenant in Auth0. So in my case, that was the Ben Dechrai -test.auth0.com. That's my tenant. So they'll be redirected to your tenant. And once they've logged in, Auth0 needs to know where to redirect people back to. So we need to specify that in the application here. And in our case, rather than hard coding it, we're just going to say that we also always want to send them back to window.location.origin, which is where they came from. So if you log in from localhost port 3000, you'll be redirected back to localhost 3000. Now, there's a few other things that I want to do in here before we continue, though, and that's to enable some better history mechanisms. So at the moment, what we're doing is we're saying that they should always be sent back to the origin, which is localhost port 3000. We also want to allow other areas of the application to define where the user should be redirected to. And a lot of this is automatically done by the SDK, but we need to provide a mechanism for the main root application point here, where we jump into the application, where everything gets set up. We need to find a way of determining whether or not the history has been changed and whether we've got a different redirect endpoint that we want to go to. So we're going to define a, let's just pull this out here. We're going to define a history, which we're going to use history, and that's part of the React Router DOM as well. So there's nothing magic to do there. And we're going to define a callback here, which is going to be the on redirect callback. And into this we need to pass in the app state. And then that is going to use the history object that we just pulled in. And we're going to push into the history object. So the place we actually want to go to is going to come from app state. If app state exists, that question mark there is basically going to allow us to look at app state and then look at elements inside it. In this case, we want to find the return to value. If app state wasn't defined, though, if it's undefined, then that would cause an error at this point. So we just stick a question mark in there, which in JavaScript basically means if this doesn't exist, then fail gracefully. And if it does fail, then what we want to do is default to window.location.pathname. So that's going to be basically redirect back to the URL you came from. Then down here, we'll just pass that callback function into the Auth0 provider. On redirect callback, we want to call on redirect callback. And that's pretty much it. We're now done with configuring the Auth0 provider within the React application. Everything else has been done by the fact that we pulled in the Auth0 React SDK. So this is not going to really be very helpful, though. If we come back to our application over here and we refresh, it's not going to work because I need to restart npm. So if it's going to open it up again. So let's come in here. It's going to reload, but we can't do anything. There's no login button or a logout button. So we need to define a login and logout button. let's do that by creating a new component up here, and we'll call this login button. And in here, we want to import React from React. And then what we're going to do is use a hook that Auth0 provides, or the SDK provides, to pull extra information out. So we're going to import the use Auth0 hook from Auth0 React. And now we're going to define our login button. What we want to do is we want to use this use Auth0 hook to get information out about where how to do the login. So there's a method called login with redirect. Redirect with a D, not from, and that's going to be use Auth0. So we now have access to a method called login with redirect, which we can call when the user clicks on the button. So let's return a button, and because we've got the Bootstrap library built in, so I've just hit enter and that's pulled in automatically at the top here, button from React Bootstrap. So we're going to use Bootstrap for this. A lot of the rest of this application, it's obviously broken because we're in the middle of stuff, is based on Bootstrap, so it's going to fit in quite nicely. And when somebody clicks on the button, we want to call a method. We want to call login. So going to give me the autocomplete, login with redirect. And just to make it look a little bit nicer, we're also going to use variant, which is built into the Bootstrap component. So we're going to say variant here is primary. And the value is going to be login. And then we need to export default login button. So I'm just going to do save as, and we're going to save this as well as log out button. Just notice there's a, so something that happens with me sometimes is as I'm typing, it'll try and import things for me automatically. Because I'd typed in use auth and I'd forgotten the 0, and then I typed in use auth0 here, code automatically imported that, but this obviously doesn't exist. So that's an error. I'm just going to delete that one. And we'll come back into the login button. I noticed that one was up here, so we'll delete that one. Back to the logout button. So we'll change this here to logout button. And this is the logout button. And instead of pulling in login with redirect, we want to pull in the logout function. And when somebody clicks on it, it'll call the logout function. And finally, we'll change the button title to say logout. So now we've got two new components, login and logout, which we need to add into the navigation or the navbar. So we'll jump up to the navbar here. You can see that the main navbar that gets returned, again, it's a Bootstrap navbar, and part of it is the main navbar itself. Or rather the brand information, the main navbar, and then there's this auth0nav component here, which is defined here. So at the moment, there's nothing coming out. So let's change that to actually return the buttons. So we need to know which button to show. The use Auth0 hook is going to give us more information that we can use for this purpose. So what we want to do is deconstruct the is authenticated part of the use Auth0 hook. So now that's going to give us a Boolean. Is the user authenticated or not? So we can return based on whether or not is authenticated is set. We will return. So if it is set, we want the logout button. And if it's not set, then we want the login button. So that should, not sure why that's logout button is not defined. Let's just make sure we're putting that in. Okay, so what I did there was I just hit Control Space in code, which brings up the context menu. And I said I want to auto put it in, which meant that right at the top here, it's added this code in. And in fact, code has added these 3 lines in for us. That's one of the things I like about code. It helps a lot with the auto completion, as well as the auto importing of the components and modules we need. So now theoretically, if I come back over here and we refresh, we have an error, which always happens in live demos. So let's have a look at what's going on here. Are there any errors down at the bottom here? It's always helpful. I'm going to actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to restart React, because one of the other things is, having created the .env file, the env file is only read the first time you start npm. So I wonder whether it was that. If in doubt during development, always restart your npm environment. Questions just come through. How does it automatically import files, and what extension are you using? I'm not actually using an extension for that. What happens is, because code is aware of how npm-based JavaScript applications work, because package.json defines everything that we have, and because everything is in node modules, and there's a consistent way of pulling in all of the modules in. And when I say consistent, when we're actually coding, we can pull in that, for example. So the npm environment, when it's running, is aware of this. And what code does is it simply emulates that. So it knows that it can possibly find a use auth0 function or object somewhere in a library, and having indexed it, it'll suggest this one here, and it'll pull it in for you. Now, the downside to this is that sometimes you can have multiple libraries that provide objects or methods that have the same name. So I've had an issue in the past sometimes where I will pull in, for example, when I've been using multiple routers, which is not necessarily always a good idea. But if you then autocomplete router and it then auto imports router, sometimes it can pull the wrong one in. So if you're getting issues, and then autocomplete can sometimes be your enemy. But yeah, I've got no extensions for this. So code does this out of the box with React applications. I know it works on Gatsby as well. I'm pretty sure it'll work on other JavaScript, NPM, Node.js type applications as well, and probably across different stacks. So if you're coding in C# or .NET, then I'm sure it has an integration of some sort automatically for that as well. Right, so we're still getting an error here. Hooks can only be called inside the body function of a component. So that is happening because I forgot one part here. So in the index here, I am calling this use history hook here. This can only be done inside of a component. So what we need to do, we actually need to wrap this into a component. And what I'm going to do, rather than wrap the whole thing into a component, I'm going to extract the code that I've added to this page into a separate component that we can then just wrap around the app. That probably doesn't make a huge amount of sense at the moment, so I'm just going to do it and talk through what's happening. So in the same directory as the index.js here, which is this source directory, I'm going to create a new file, and we'll call this auth0, what is it, is a provider with history, because that's mainly the issue that we're having, is the history is causing us an issue here. So I'm going to create this auth0 provider with history, and that should be a dot, not a comma. In here, and then from this page here, I'm going to pull, let's just copy all of this for now. But we don't need half of this. So we don't need React DOM or app. We need the auth0 provider, because that's what we're using. We just need use history here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap all of this into its own component. So we'll define that component here as auth0 provider with history. So we're going to receive into this the children. And if you're not familiar with this, then I'll cover that in a second. So here's our new, I'm just going to grab all of that. I'm going to move that into this function here. Let's just save that. Now, we don't actually want to return all of this. What we want to do is just return the auth0 provider. From there to there. And then we want to export default auth0 provider with history. So let's just have a quick look at what I've done here. Before, we pulled in the use history, we defined the onRedirect callback, and then we wrapped the app inside the auth0 provider. What we want to do now, though, is extract all of that out. So instead of wrapping the app, we're going to wrap the children with the auth0 provider, and that's what we're returning. So now back in the index page here, I can actually get rid of all this code that I wrote before. So that's pretty much like it was when we first loaded the page. And now what I can do is I can pull in the auth0 provider with history here. and I can put the app inside there. You can see that it's pulled this in automatically using that awesome magic code insertion. So this is exactly the same code now, except I've extracted all of the stuff that I did to this page, and I've put it into this component. And what that does, as well as perhaps make it easier to read, is it means now that when we call this hook here, the use history hook, it's inside a component, which is what's required with React for it to work. So I'm just going to save that, and hopefully now, okay, it's automatically refreshed in my browser, and you can see at the top now we have this login button. So if I hit the login page, it'll take me through to my my domain over here, bendechrai.test.auth0.com, but you'll notice that there's a configuration error. So what we've done is we've taken Auth0, we've created a configuration set in Auth0 for this application called My App, and we've applied the SDK to React, but now what we need to do is configure Auth0 to accept connections from that React application. There are three things we need to do in order to allow Auth0 to be the authentication provider for this new application. So I'm just going to jump back into our app here. So we've got the URL here. This is where we're running it, localhost port 3000. And we need to paste that into these three boxes here, and I'll tell you why. With this one here, I'm just going to take this trailing slash off just to make it more compatible with all the URLs. The allowed callback URL, once somebody logs in, Auth0 needs to know where to redirect you back to. So the application is telling Auth0 where to do that, but Auth0 also needs to have essentially a whitelist of destinations that it can be sent to, because we don't want Auth0 accidentally redirecting them to a whole different website because maybe there was a man-in-the-middle attack. So we need to define where Auth0 is allowed to send our users back to. We also need to define where Auth0 is allowed to send our users back to after logout, so they don't accidentally get sent to the wrong website. And finally, when people are using the application, the Auth0 SDK is going to be making background calls to see whether or not the user's logged in. If somebody refreshes the web page, for example, it'll try and see if there's a session existing between the user and the Auth0 website to automatically log them back in. So there's a whole lot of things that happen where Auth0 needs to verify where those requests are coming from. That's also going to be defined as our website. So that's why we set these three. Having done that, we need to come down to the bottom and just click on Save Changes. And now if I come over here, I shouldn't need to hit refresh because there's nothing's changed in our application. If I hit login, we now get to the login page. So this is the login page, again, at my tenant up here. I have an account already. If you're doing this for the first time, you won't have any accounts in your tenant, so you'll need to come down here and sign up. Remember, this is signing up or logging into your application now, not into Auth0. So we're logging into my app. So I'm going to put in the username password of my test user, which I can't type while also talking. I can't type my email address apparently while also talking. There we go. So what it's doing now is it's requesting access to my profile information, which I'm going to accept. If you're doing this in production, it's not going to ask you that every time. It's in fact, most of the time it won't ask you at all. What it's doing is because you're running it on localhost, it'll ask you, it's specifically ask you on localhost. You can also enable it to happen all the time in production, but most of the time in production, you won't see that happening. You can see now that we've got the logout button at the top there instead of the login button. That's because the application has made a call or checked with that is authenticated and showing the logout button instead. So that's authentication done. What are we? We're about half an hour in. That's cool. So if I wasn't talking so much, that would probably have taken you maybe 15 minutes. So we can now move on, having integrated authentication, configured Auth0. That's pretty much all you need to do in Auth0. There are other things you can do. You could come through into connections, social, for example, and say, I want people to be able to log in with Dropbox or Twitter or Yahoo as well, for example. So there are also other configuration changes you can make in Auth0 at this point, adding single sign-on, whatever else. But this is the minimum that you need to do for the integration with your application. The rest of it is all configuration based now. So coming back to our application, we want to make sure that this route is private. We don't want people getting here if they're not logged in. So if we log out and we come back to the profile page, we can still read it. So previously, we would have had to do a couple of checks in the actual page itself in the view. So in the profile here, what we might have done is created a use the use effect hook here, or we would have said on when component is loaded, or whatever the terminology is in the older class style of components. But the new SDK gives us this really easy way of making sure that a whole component can be protected. So in here, we can just type in with authentication required, which is basically a callback that gets pulled in because I typed that in. It hasn't done it. So if I do the control space trick and I auto import that, so we've now got with authentication required from the Auth0 React SDK. So this is now going to automatically make sure that the only way the profile is going to be loaded is if the user is authenticated. So if I hit save on that and switch over here really quickly, I didn't hit refresh. It gets that React is hot loading. So you'll notice that I was on the profile page and it's forced me to go to the login page. Let's just go back to the home page here and see what happens. So if I click on the profile page again now, and no hands on the keyboard, is just redirected me to the login page. So we can now see that once logged in, we can actually get here. This route is now actually private. So what can we actually do with this information, though? So we've got a user who's logged in, and we've got an ID token. But what does the ID token look like? So this is another thing we can get from the use Auth0 hook. So we'll deconstruct the user object out of the use Auth0 hook there. And now let's just... Sometimes I'll pull individual bits out, but let's just have a look at exactly what's in an ID token. Like if you want to know more about how JSON Web Tokens work as well, stick something in the comments, ask a question if you want to know more about what's inside a token and how they work. I'm happy to go through that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the JSON stringify call. I'm going to take the user object, and if I pass in null4, that's going to space indent automatically with 4 spaces. Here we go. So this is the JSON that comes out of the JSON Web Token. And the information that we get, this is a typical user information that you get from Auth0 if somebody is logged in using an email address and a password. So the email address obviously becomes the name because we don't have anything else. The only thing we ask for to create an account is an email address and a password. It'll take everything before the @ and it'll turn that into the nickname. Because I have a gravatar associated with my name, it can also pull that out. It knows when my account was last updated. It knows whether or not I've verified my email. So when I created my account first time, I would have received an email saying, can you please verify that it looks like somebody just signed up. Please click here to verify to make sure that I am actually the owner of that email address. If I had clicked that, this would be true. And finally, we get the subject. So this is the unique code that you will use in your application to remember who I am. So previously, if you're writing an application, you'd have to store a username and password. Now you just need to store the subject. SUB here stands for subject. Now, if we come over here and we have a look under users, we'll see the user in here. So this is the one that I'm logged in as. We'll see Auth0 5E ending in CF. And that's Auth0 5E ending in CF. So this here is the unique ID that's associated with just this user. So in the future, if I log out and I log back in, whether or not my email address has changed or my password has changed or any of my other details have changed, if I'm logging in with this user, then this is the subject you'll get back. So you can rely on this to be the unique identifier for your user. So that took me another 5 minutes. So as you can see now, we're getting improvements in speed of being able to actually just work on our own application. If we wanted to create a prettier profile page, we can come into the profile page here now instead. And let's get rid of this paragraph token. And we can put in an image source equal to user.picture. And I'm just going to set a width, because it could be massive, of 400 on this. And now we have my profile picture come in. And I could, instead of saying profile, we can now say hello user.nickname. Ben. So already we've now managed to get a lot more customizing into here. We've made sure that this page itself, if I hit log out now, it's going to take me back to the home page because obviously I can't view the profile page. If I go back to the profile page, it's going to force me to log in. So we've got a bit of authentication happening to get in, and then also being able to control the endpoints. That, in a nutshell, is where I wanted to get us to today. I'd love to get any questions on whether you want me to go over in depth a bit more about how the login process works. If there's anything that I've skipped over too quickly that you need me to go into more depth on, I'd love to hear that. If there are any things outside of what I've spoken about today to do with Auth0 or authentication or security in general, or even about React, then I'd be happy to take your questions. Thanks. I will also go back to this page here, this preview, so you have my contact details if you want to get in touch with me after the fact. How to access protected routes in the backend. Well, there is no backend, but if you were doing an API, for example, with React, the only way, please show us the VS Code extensions that I find helpful. So the extensions that I have installed, I use Cloak, but that's mostly because when I'm doing live demos, if any of you ever do live demos, the Cloak one, if I do Cloak hide secrets, will basically hide anything on the screen. That can be useful sometimes. Let's just show those again. ESLint is a good one. Any of the linting tools are usually good. I use LiveShare as well. I've actually had a couple of issues with LiveShare. LiveShare, if you haven't used it, is a really great way of doing pair programming, especially at the moment where we have to all work from home. If you're used to pair programming, you can get somebody else to connect to your local code environment, and when they type, it updates your code. So it's not like they have the code on their machine as well. It's like a virtual machine for them, or like a virtual connection, but it provides other things as well. So it'll allow them to view your localhost hosted website from their machine. So code changes they make, they can see the changes straight away. Elaborate more on tokens, ID tokens. Are they like keys in React? I'm not sure what you mean by keys in React, but essentially tokens, a great website is jwt.io, JSON Web Tokens. So this was written by a colleague of mine, and basically a token is composed of three things. So if we just jump out here, okay, so I'm not logged in at the moment. Let's open up our network console, and I'm going to log in. Just make sure that I'm persisting logs. Yep. So once I've logged in, there's a call down here to get a token. That's the options. There's the post. So what happens is the way that the login flow works is you get redirected to Auth0, or your user does. Your user logs in. Then once they're logged in, there's a callback that goes back to your React application, and there's a code that gets sent with that callback. That code doesn't have any information in it because it could be intercepted, but that code can then be used by your React application to make a call to Auth0 to say, now I want the tokens. So that's what's happening at this point here. Let's see if I can make this a bit bigger. So this is the post request to get the token. And we can see the response here. There are two tokens. There's an access token. The access token can also be a JSON Web Token. At the moment, because we haven't defined any third-party APIs or any APIs for it to integrate with, it's just sending back an opaque token, and this is the opaque token that gets used to ask Auth0 for more information about a user. But you don't need to worry about that. But you can see here the ID tokens. The ID token is a token that tells you about the identity of the person. The access token is a token that allows you to access other things. There's another one called a refresh token, which we don't generally get in front page applications because the security around them is a little higher. There are ways of doing it in front page applications as well, but as you can see, it's not being returned by default. The ID token is a long set of base64 URL encoded strings. And you can see here it's color-coded them automatically. They're separated with a full stop. The first part is the header. The second part is the payload. And these two, if we base64 URL decoded these, you would get this JSON out. So they're not encrypted. They're not secure in any way. If I was able to intercept somebody's token, I would have access to the entire payload. What the signature does, though, is it allows the consumer of the token, so in our case, our React app, can look at the signature and verify that the payload hasn't been changed. So we can rely on the fact that the data in the payload has not been modified in transit from the point that it was issued by Auth0. The types of information that we already saw when we looked at it back on when we dumped it out into our React app, You can see the name, the picture. There's other things like issued at, the expiry, the audience, subject, the issuer itself, so you can make sure that you know which login page provided the token. So there's various bits of information here that are not all for human consumption. Some of them are used for verification of the token itself. But that's what the identity token looks like. An access token, if it was a JSON Web token, would have other information in here, like the scope. What is it that the user can do? So if you had an access token to access an API, that scope might say things like, imagine you've got a blogging system. It might say this person is allowed to create a blog post, is allowed to delete their own blog posts, but can't delete anybody else's blog posts. Or if they're an admin, maybe they do have permission to delete other people's blog posts. That's where the scopes come in, and those will be put into the access token. I'm not sure that's what you mean by keys in React. Sharing the code with you, the SDK, this one here, I'll paste that in here, and maybe you can share that with the other channels that we're in at the moment. But this here has been taken from a blog post that was published by somebody else at Auth0. So you can use this as a starting point. It doesn't have Auth0 built in yet, but the best thing to do, really, if you want to get started, is you can even just deploy a bog standard basic React app from nothing, like a basic starter installer, not pulling down this starter app, which has routers and everything else built in already. And once you create your application and you jump over to the quick start guide here, I'll just go through this a little more slowly so we can see what level of detail it goes into. So I've already mentioned that when you create your app, you get your domain and your client ID. So it'll point out to you here that this is where they're at. And we had to configure the callback URL, logout URL, and the allowed web origins in Auth0. So it'll tell you in the documentation here to do that. Then you install the Auth0 React SDK, and it'll take you through. This is going directly into the index.js. So the way that I started the demo today was by putting this directly into the index.js, but you'll notice here we're not using the with history. So checking out the Auth0, I wonder whether I can actually reverse search this and find the blog post that went with it. Let's have a look at blog auth0.com. I can certainly follow up and find the actual blog post that this GitHub repo is for. I'll also recommend to my my colleague Dan that we put that into the repo so we can reverse that search more easily. But yeah, once you're going through the quick start, that's also a really good way of getting into it. And the other thing is that I'm not sure what technologies everyone who's listening here are going to use. If you're using React, then obviously what I'm talking about today is highly applicable to you. But if you want to use, let's go back, Angular or Vue or even vanilla JavaScript, if you're writing your own application, like a native application, I don't know if I can have the same name. Looks like I can have the same name. Then each of these changes depending on the type of application you're writing. So if you're writing a React Native, or maybe you're doing an iOS Swift app, then there's how-to guides for each one of those. So I'd recommend actually following the how-to guide to get it into whichever stack you're using. We've got SDKs for dozens of different stacks. There was another question, sharing the codes, ID tokens. Can you tell me more about refresh tokens? I was trying to set it up on one of my apps, but I didn't really understand how to. So the purpose of refresh tokens, and they're more commonly used. So until a few months ago, they were most commonly used on things like native applications, like iOS and Android apps, and on traditional apps where you've got a Python or a PHP or a Java backend, for example. And what the refresh token does, in order to keep your users secure, you always have to assume the worst. Whenever it comes to security, you assume the worst. if somebody gets access to an access token, then they can talk to an API as though they were the person that they got the access token from. So in order to increase security, you set the expiry on access tokens quite short. If you're, I actually heard about some examples of the amount of time, because there's no right answer to how long the expiry should be. If you're Netflix, for example, I think their access tokens are set at a day, because if the access token does get compromised somehow, if somebody gets my access token, for example, then the worst that can happen is somebody watches Netflix for free. Netflix don't really lose any actual money. At the end of the 24-hour period, or whatever's left of that 24-hour period, the token's going to stop working. If you're an internet banking website, though, you can't leave it for 24 hours. You might have something that's 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute even, just long enough to do those transactions. You might even choose to have different access tokens for different levels of work. Maybe you've got one access token to just access internet banking and see statements, and then a separate access token, which is a lot shorter lifetime for doing things like financial transactions. So there's different ways of treating tokens. The refresh token is and the reason why it's traditionally not been done in front-end applications is because if you've got a refresh token, it basically allows you to get a new access token. So the refresh token is used by your backend server to talk directly to Auth0 to say, my access token is expired, please send me a new one. And it'll do that. So that allows your user to feel like they're logged in longer while still allowing your application to use short-lived access tokens for higher security. In terms of why it wasn't working or understanding how to, I'm not sure what particular issue you faced there. So I'd be happy to take more detail, or maybe we can have a chat about it afterwards. The documentation, if you follow it through, if it's not working for you, let me know, and we can look into that in a bit more detail.
So I guess this is where we will be now ending the session. This was really a beautiful session. Concepts
Thanks.
really well explained. I even had an amazing time being a part of it. Thank
Good.
you so much for coming, and thank you
You're
so much for
welcome.
doing this.
Thanks for having me.
So,
And like I've said, I'll just put this back up. If anybody's got any questions, my DMs on Twitter are open, so you can send me a message on Twitter or email me directly if you like, if you're not a Twitter user. I'm on LinkedIn as well. I don't check it often, but I get some people connecting up with me there. So whichever method works for you best.
yeah, one last question, if you would like to answer.
Yes.
Yeah.
What do you use more, class-based components or functional components? With the introduction of hooks, I see many people using only functional. I generally try and stick, if I'm writing anything new now, it'll be functional. If I am working on an old application that has class-based, obviously you can still use both inside the same bit of code. Then it depends on how pedantic I'm feeling, and I can be quite pedantic sometimes. So I might see a class-based component converted to functional if I need a bit of a break from what I'm doing, different headspace. So yeah, if it's new stuff, as far as possible. And it was an interesting question, because for a while there were some things you couldn't do in functional components, but now with hooks and use state and things like that, it's a lot easier to keep everything functional. And I think from a readability perspective, for me, it looks neater. It's a personal preference, but I find that functional components look neater as well. All right, well, given there are no other questions, thanks very much. Oh, there is one more. Is there any advantage of functional components? Any advantage? I don't actually know. I've not looked into it, to be honest. Sorry.
So I guess that is it. So as as people have said, even a really interesting and a really great session. Thank you so much, Ben sir. And again, signing off from Eduthon. Also, just a reminder, today is the last date for registrations for the hackathon.